So again, as I said before, each week I try to bring a different set of books that pertain to what we're talking about. I have some up here today that you can peruse if you wish. Let me pull this up here. Let's see. Coming up. Okay. I'm in the right spot here. So we've hit on some of these topics as we've gone through, and we were going to have time, we hope, to talk if there's questions and things. So, but we just briefly touched on a few things, and some of them are some of the problems we have that we need to face in dealing with apologetics that we want to touch on a little bit here today, and some of you may have questions about it. So we've looked through this panorama of apologetics. We've talked about the idea of truth. That's fundamental. We have to deal with that issue because obviously, especially with postmodernism, there's just a big doubt that there is anything like truth. People have discussions about that. And then we talked about philosophical basis for our Christian faith. And then we've looked at the scientific evidences extensively. And we looked at historical Christian evidences and the validity of the New Testament in particular, and then the resurrection. Now, so we have still, though, to look back again at Genesis 1 in particular. I thought it was interesting. I wanted to get perspective. I looked at a number of these that are Hebrew and Jewish scholars and believers in that vein. And one pointed out how that the creation account of the 6 days is in 31 verses, and it's given people a great deal of problem, it seems. And there's a book out, 7 Days That Have Divided the World by John Lennox that talks about it, of course, in that same vein. And he pointed out here that in the MIT library, the Hayden Library, there are 50,000 volumes that deal with this topic, universe, cosmology. And then in the Harvard Widener Library, there are around 200,000 books on this topic. It's amazing. Again, we talked about previously about just the impact of Jesus in Christianity, just the number of books that have been written that deal with Christianity and the issues related to it, and obviously many trying to Again, what we established last week is that the New Testament documents are very well established, and the idea and understanding of what Christ did is resurrection. And so that is something that we have to keep our footing on when we get into things that we may not understand. And we remember very early on we talked about truth and how in the scriptures it talks about that there are things that are revealed for us, but there are things that are not revealed as well. And there's some things that we may not understand, and that may be difficult sometimes in our human pride to accept that maybe there are some things we don't understand. And something as complicated as we've seen already about the universe and that we continue to find out, it should keep us humble. So we've got the geologic column, the Darwinian evolution we've dealt with quite extensively, and I think we can lay that to rest. Many of those in the field actually have laid it to rest. And then radiometric dating, we briefly mentioned distant starlight. We talked about it slightly. We talked a good bit about the Big Bang. But those are some of the ones that lead to some issues about old Earth cosmology that then seem to conflict with Genesis 1 in particular. Now, just to give you some perspective of where this came from historically, antedating Darwin, Charles Lyell and James Hutton are the ones that sort of begun this process of the idea of long time spans, deep time as it's called. So he was a geologist. He wrote his book in the 1830 time frame. He released it in 3 volumes. It was called Principles of Geology, and that was typical of that time. They made very long titles, but it tells a lot about what the book is, being an attempt to explain the former changes on the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. And that is definitely what he's talking about through that book. And so that's the idea of uniformitarianism. And all of my geology will come as an illustration of my views of those principles, and as evidence strengthening the system necessarily arising out of the admission of such principles, which are neither more nor less than no causes whatever have from the earliest time to which we can look back to the present have ever acted, but that are now those acting, and that they never acted without different degrees of energy from which they now exert. In other words, another phrase he used was the present is the key to the past, and that's been a very solid foundational principle for historical geology, and really it's a principle that in many ways does obviously make sense. But again, we have to inform our decisions to go with different ideas and assumptions and beliefs based on what the biblical text tells us as well. So this gave rise to this uniformitarianism that we mentioned that opposed catastrophism that is shown in the Bible. He was influenced, as I mentioned, by James Hutton. Now, going the wrong way. So here's the geologic timetable. It's very complex now. You could probably not even read it, but again, on the, let me see if I can get anything to show up here. So this is just the going from the present all the way back, and they've got it at 4.6 billion years. And so our current time frame in the Cenozoic right here is the more recent, which is just this really tiny little sliver up here. So they've expanded this to give you an idea, but of course the long time frames go way back here where you're getting into Cambrian and Precambrian, where they have all these long time spans that they put up with this idea of uniformitarianism, that the past is the key, the present is the key to the past. And so they're basing it on what they would propose, that, well, there's no way that all these animals, and that was what it was originally came about, was about animal life in particular, and fossils, that, okay, for that to all happen, it would have to be very long time spans. And so anyway, there was this idea that, and for it to build up the layers would have to take a long, long time if they go by present processes of how things, of course, we don't even really see necessarily the formation of sedimentary rock today, but, thinking, well, it's got to take a long time for that to happen, and they just come up with these ideas. So initially it was obviously very theoretical, but has continued to be built upon. Now, so what is the issue here between these two? And in a way, this idea of catastrophism may not even be a good term. I noticed that maybe the Jewish writer, I can't remember which one, said that really it should be cataclysmic, because when you talk about the flood, it's a cataclysm. It's not just even a catastrophe. I mean, we've got catastrophes, Mount St. Helens, other disasters, tsunamis, but nothing would compare on the level of Noah's flood. So, as it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So that is describing a cataclysm in the sense that it's not just raining. Obviously, it's something's going on in the earth as well. And so anything prior to the flood is going to be destroyed. It's just a cataclysm. It's like the reworking of the earth's surface, everything, massive changes. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So again, Jesus is validating, and that's an important principle when we get back to just how strong the evidence is for the New Testament documents and for Christ's resurrection, that he has the ultimate authority. It's what he said, all authority has been given unto me. And so as Christians, if we're going to follow, what we've got, we're going to listen to the ultimate authority, and it's Jesus. He obviously validates Noah. Now, First of all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming, he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of the water and with water. By water also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So, again, these fundamental principles show that we're in clashing directly. Obviously, the world does work uniformly most of the time. But again, the whole thing that we're getting from Christ and from what he had done is that we've got to understand that there are miracles. And that's fundamentally out of the question for those that are naturalists, those that are materialists. They're going to say that we reject out of hand. We're not going to look at that at all. That there are miracles, that there's something outside the natural realm. But that's what this is all about. It is supernatural. Obviously, if God is going to enter into our realm, that is supernatural. He's entering into the natural. So things are going to be disrupted. Things are going to be different than we would normally expect by uniformitarianism, that it's not always that way. And that's going to be a fundamental flaw with that philosophy. So fossilization gets back then to this first principle that seemed to start this whole process with the historical geology. And so there's many different things about fossilization. It's not really a fossil in the way we think about it, but it is considered in that realm as freezing. I mean, there's literally, they say, up to hundreds of thousands of mammoths and things, all these frozen animals in Siberia and other parts where there was all kinds of animal life that we would have normally expected to be in more of a temperate zone is there, and they're frozen. Many with food in their stomachs. It was obviously very fast. So that's one process. Another is preservation of the hard parts in stone. And we see that all the time. You can go on Montesano Mountain. You've got seashells there, or anything that's got a hard. So it's a process where that part is preserved. But there's also preservation of entire organisms in stone. And so those are very amazing, like in amber particularly. There's some ambers in Northern Europe areas, the Baltic areas, that are just gigantic, and they've got all these completely preserved, and you can study their DNA even. And so, again, something fast happened. And then there's preservation by carbonization, that would be like in coal particularly, or oil. There's finding of preserved remnants of life there. There's very big coal fields out from Tuscaloosa. I spent some time there while I was in college at University of Alabama, and you can go out there and you can find all kinds of things, ferns. It's just amazing, and preserved in the layers with the coal beds. It's really amazing to see that. But the other thing, though, that's amazing is to see, and that's where you find a lot of these things, is that you find the carbonization of a tree, but it's going across these layers. Does that make sense? So that you see things that are like that are amazing. And then there's preservation by cast or mold, like a footprint or where an animal was, but it's totally gone, but you just see the mold left behind. And then there's petrification. But all of these things require rapid protection. And because we know that we don't see, it's rare to observe any kind of fossilization now. With Mount St. Helens, there was examples of that, but again, it was rapid. And so it's something we don't witness. It's something that we don't find happening all over the place, like just profuse fossils that are available all over the world, massive amounts of fossils. And so it had to be protected from scavengers, from decay and environmental destruction that normally happens all the time. That not being preserved, they're not being fossilized because they're being destroyed. It has to be rapidly protected by some means, or it won't happen. And it needs to have it requires a lot of pressure to make that happen as well. And so all of that fits very well with the rapid deposits that would occur in a massive cataclysm like is described in the flood. And the other aspect about fossilization that is interesting is that a lot of these we do find where they're layered and spread out, but there's most of the time you find them all heaped together. And there's massive fossil graveyards in the western United States in particular, where they're just jam-packed together, just all massively crushed together. It's amazing, which you would expect, and all kinds of torrents and all these water going different places. And different size animals would seek different levels of ability to try to preserve themselves, and maybe at different levels as well. And of course, sedimentation as it occurs will layer out in different ways as well. So a lot of these things. And the other thing to consider is that if you consider from a uniformitarian standpoint, that the layers, if they're taking massive amounts of times like we saw in the geologic timescale, that you would expect to see effects of erosion, pitting, all kinds of different things, but yet the layers, you go even to Grand Canyon, they're just so finely preserved between it. It's not like there's all this things that happened before the next layer came down to disturb it, and none of that is being demonstrated. So now moving to more modern times, and just to give you a perspective of how these people think, I use their quotes and some of the things they did. So Richard Goldschmidt, he lived from 1878 to 1958. He came from Germany, immigrated after the rise of anti-Semitism, and became a professor at University of California in Berkeley. And here are some of his quotes. In spite of the immense amount of paleontologic material and the existence of long series of intact stratigraphic sequences with perfect records for lower categories, transitions between the higher categories are missing. And so you find, as I mentioned before, as opposed to what goes on in the regular schools of teaching our children and people in college and professors beating up on Christians and trying to find out what you believe, that those that are actually discussing among themselves and being honest about their research, that was one of the problems he faced. He said, we can't find these transitional forms. There is no evidence of transitional forms that you would expect myriad abundance of if you're going to have the great variety of life we see that's been existing. There should be all kinds of transitional forms, and they're not there. They can't find it. And it's good to keep in mind that nobody has ever succeeded in producing even one new species by the accumulation of micromutations. Darwin's theory of natural selection has never had any proof, yet it has been universally accepted and continues to be taught, obviously, to our children. It's impossible for micromutation to form any new species. The decisive step in evolution, the first step toward macroevolution, the step from one species to another, requires another evolutionary method than that of sheer accumulation of micromutations. So that was the thing that troubled me, is there's just no way to make this happen. So he came up with the idea of the hopeful monster. In other words, you have an egg, the chicken's sitting on it, but it hatches out a new, totally new species. In other words, that's, the hopeful monster. In other words, it's just pop, there it is. And so, because it's like, we're not finding this in the fossil record, we don't see it from biology happening. What are we going to do? And so, there you're back to miracles in a way. It's a miracle, but no, we can't accept miracles except this kind. And then George Gaylord Simpson, American paleontologist, 1902 to 1984, who served variously as professor of zoology at Columbia University and curator of the Department of Geology, Paleontology at American Museum of Natural History, and also professor of geosciences at the University of Arizona. It remains true, as every paleontologist knows, that most new species, families, and that nearly all categories above the level of families appear in the records suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely continuous transitional sequences. It is now firmly established, and this is another one that it's interesting he brings this up, because obviously this is something that's still taught a lot of times, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Basically what that's saying is that what goes on in the embryo, it goes through these stages of, quote, the gills and the tail and all that, which was really made up by Ernst Haeckel, the German that produced this idea after reading Darwin, and drew the diagrams that everybody sees. A lot of times it's completely erroneous. But he said that, it's now firmly established that ontogeny does not repeat phylogeny. And then man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. So he was involved in the development of modern synthesis of Darwinian evolution. We spoke of that previously, where you're trying to meld together what Darwin said and how you do that with what we know by genetics and microevolution. But obviously, with the shortcomings of that, we've already seen was deposed, that he proposed quantum theory of evolution. And again, that's somewhat like the hopeful monster idea, that you've got these quantum leaps. Just all of a sudden, there's this massive change in the species, body forms and things like that. But he called it quantum evolution. Then there's Stephen Jay Gould. He's an American paleontologist and evolutionary biologist, 1941 to 2002. He died at age 60. He's professor at Harvard University and New York University simultaneously, and also at the New York Museum of Natural History. I'm one of the curators there. My own field of paleontology has strongly challenged the Darwinian premise that life's major transformations can be explained by adding up through immensity of geological time the successive tiny changes produced generation after generation by natural selection. We are glorious accidents of an unpredictable process with no drive to complexity, not the expected results of evolutionary principles that yearn to produce a creature capable of understanding the mode of its own necessary construction. And so he was very frustrated again, also, as were the others, that we can't find the fossils, we don't find a biological process that's working. And so he, along with Niles Eldredge, came up with the theory of punctuated equilibrium as another attempt to address this problem of the lack of transitional forms, of where you have these gaps, and it just is punctuated. But he used it by just species kind of getting isolated away from the others, and that way, because it was maybe a small group, they could evolve somewhere over here protected, and then they become more dominant and have these changes occur. So anyway, and he said that would be why we can't find their fossils, because there was just too few. Now, the other area that kind of came in then after this period of time with what happened with Charles Lyell and then with Darwin, eventually in the early 1900s, it came up with the beginning of radiometric dating. Now, these give very long time spans depending on what you use. So the idea is that you have a parent compound in the rock or fossil that you're looking at, and then it's going to decay to a daughter compound, and you can measure the ratios and figure out, well, how long did that take? And you do it with their half-lives and figure out, well, then this has to be this old. But I mean, just from a, you have to make assumptions to do this. And the biggest assumptions have to do with how much daughter was present and how much parent was present at the initiation of this process. And they've come up with all kinds of different ideas of how to fix that and to say, okay, we're compensating for that and we're making. But that's a very difficult thing to accept. There's a lot of assumptions there. I mean, really. And then the other side of the equation is, well, what about daughter or parent leaching in or out of the material? That there could be some changes there as well, and that some's being lost or some's being added. So there's a whole lot of areas where you're making assumptions to make it produce, in many ways, the results you need to document the geologic timetable. And back to the geologic timetable, a lot of that had to do with saying, well, how old did the biologists think this fossil would have to be for this to be here? And then that gives us an idea of how old this has to be. But then the biologists say, well, I'm looking at how old the rocks are that you're telling me to tell you how old they are. So in some ways, there's some circular reasoning there. Now, I'm sure you've heard of these different ones. There's a number of these. And they're different in a way from the earlier ones I mentioned, in the sense that the ones we looked at least were honest enough to say, we've got problems. But these today are, this new atheism is really what it is. They're very aggressive, and they're not really very useful in a scientific standpoint, but they're very aggressive in going after those that believe in creation, and very hostile towards it. And, say a number of things that are very hostile. I mean, Richard Dawkins, would marginalize those that have beliefs like we do, as far as Christianity and all, that that we should be in the same category as Holocaust deniers, because we're just not accepting what's known by everybody, and that everybody knows this is true, that what we're telling you about evolution, and so There's lots of writings that they've done, very profuse. They get into debates a lot with creationists, and I don't think they hold their own very well at all, but they have been very widely read and talk very aggressively against Christianity and belief in God. Now, I want a minute to look at this, that, again, getting back to what I said earlier, there are two books to consider. I mean, this was interesting. It goes back in the philosophy, Christian philosophy evidences, that there's the book of God and there's the book of nature. Galileo was pointing that out earlier, that we've got these two books, and the Bible mentions that as well. Romans 1, very good at mentioning that. So there's special revelation, which is the Bible, and there's general revelation, which is nature. To remember is that the book of God is immutable, as the revelation has been once for all entrusted to us. So it's been delivered to us, and it's up to us to try to understand it. Obviously, there's nuances and things that we may not understand even there, like Peter said, there's many things that are difficult that Paul wrote, he said, that are difficult for us to understand even. And the book of nature must be continually updated and revised as creation continues to pour forth speech, like Psalm 19:2. So science is going to have to be malleable. That's the nature of it. As we looked earlier about the philosophy of science, how that even Hawking said, there's nothing that is always established. There's always change going on in science because we're continually learning new things that change the whole paradigm. And they're like, oh, okay, we didn't realize that. That's something we didn't know. And that's where we find that the book of God has stood the test of time, because every time that it's been tested and come up against these things, they say, oh, well, that's not possible, that's wrong. Eventually it's proven, hey, that actually was right. The Bible did get it right. We just didn't know at that time what we do now. And so it really does give us pause to think about this when we're overawed by what something may come out as science is saying to us, that maybe there's some mistake there. There's some assumptions wrong, something we don't know yet, because science is always changing. It's not like, where it says in Hebrews that the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's not like that when you come to the book of nature, because we're continually hearing the speech that's being poured forth, and we're finding more and more out, and things change. So supernatural revelation, when we consider that, just to consider, again, about the special character of Scriptures, that we have the unity of the Scriptures is amazing, because we have maybe 40 authors, the 66 books. You've got a time span of about 1,600 years from the time of Moses, about 1500 BC, all the way up to the last, with the book of Revelation, approximately AD, 100 AD. So you've got this big time span, and yet it's united. These people, many of them obviously didn't know each other. They couldn't communicate with one another. They lived in different cultures, times, places, and yet there's this unity that comes out throughout the story that the Bible is revealing to us, this amazing unity. And the content of Scriptures, that also is amazing. This is not how men write. When you look at the stories, we talked about it a little bit earlier last time, about just, again, how the Bible is unique because it puts itself in history. And it does so like a very disinterested reporter in many ways. It reports embarrassing details. It gives things that you wouldn't normally expect, like all the things about the life of David, and you look at what happened with him, or Judah, and Jacob. It's just all the, you get the warts and all. There's no trying to gloss it over and make our heroes like they're perfect and wonderful, and yet there's this unifying message going throughout the whole thing. You have in the day of, obviously in the day of the New Testament times, when Jesus was crucified, at that time, women weren't very much respected as far as being able to be witnesses, and yet here you've got the men held up with a locked door, and the women say, well, we're going out to the grave and we're going to do something about Jesus' body here, and the men are huddled up, scared to death. Well, most people aren't going to write that about themselves and saying, we're scared, and the women are going out here, and they found out what was going on. But obviously, we know that's true. I mean, I have many times when Kay says, hey, we're going to do this. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, we're not. But no, that's how we end up doing it. So when they make their minds up, they're going to do it, they're going to do it. But the Bible presents these things in ways that we wouldn't expect. So it's just unique content. And then all the fulfilled prophecies of the Bible, I've got a number of them listed here in the handout, but, you've got all these prophecies being going on throughout the Old Testament, and yet they're fulfilled explicitly in the New about Jesus. And there's a number of prophecies, of course. You're all aware of that. Now, again, we mentioned this briefly, but again, just to give you some examples, that Jesus validates the Old Testament. And so that's an important point to keep in mind of how we have our security and through the resurrection because of Jesus' authority. In Matthew 19:4, he validates the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Luke 17:26-27, he validates about Noah and the flood. Luke 17:29, he talks about the destruction of Sodom by fire and brimstone. Luke 17:32, he talks about the transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt. Matthew 12:40, he talks about Jonah and the great fish. Luke 11:32, he talks about the repentance of the Ninevites. So Jesus is validating the New Testament. The New Testament writers, validating the Old Testament, and the New Testament writers do as well in their references to the Old Testament documents. So, what is our approach to be then of Genesis 1 and 2? There's the plain language historical theory. That's in other words, you just take it what it says. Okay, I don't understand some of the things about these long time spans, but it says this. The average person reading it's going to say that's days. That's what it says. Okay. I accept that. We're going to learn more about it later. I don't understand what it is. I can accept that on faith, that it says what it says, and what we don't understand will be figured out at some point. And then there's the gap theory. We mentioned that previously about the idea that between Genesis 1 and 2 and the rest, there's a gap. That maybe that's the time frame. Maybe that's when the Big Bang and billions of years happened until we come. And then it becomes more of a daytime type normal days. Well, there's the day-age theory, where each day represents some vast age and time going by. And then there's the framework theory, where it's like, well, it's just sort of an overall picture. It's not meant to be taken literally, somewhat allegorical, different things like that. And then eventually you go to the next step, which is like a mythic literary theory. It's just like all the other ancients have stories about creation that they come up with. And so you've got all these different ideas, and there's many more. But and then I've got some of the books of some of the writers that do that. And I think that, I have no problem accepting people that obviously profess the name of Christ and yet have some of these ideas, as long as, it doesn't make them lose their faith. But I think it does open the door for a lot of problems that lead to potentially, eventually falling away, because eventually you've got to hit that problem that, hey, this doesn't make sense. And there's something that's not right here. Somebody's not telling the truth, or, something like that. So it can become a thing that leads people to a loss of faith. Let me see what I had. So one of the things to consider about some of the theological problems then of the old earth cosmology, that just to, put a stone in our shoe for ourselves, is that if God used evolution to create the diversity of life, then it means that death is actually the instrument he wielded in the process. Through tens of millions of years of disease, deforming mutations, tooth and claw, ever-advancing forms of life emerge from the struggle and the enormously wasteful and painfully cruel mechanism demanded by evolution. Can we really believe with such a scenario that it would be recorded in Genesis 1:31 that God saw all that he made and said it was very good? That was how he created. Instead of Paul's discourse on Adam in Romans 5, that Adam ushered in death by his sin, the modern enlightened understanding is that death brought Adam to life. And then finally, the presentation of the creation as very good and the utopian nature of Eden does not comport with a world of pain, violence, predation, disease, mutational deformity, natural disasters, and death. They would have to proceed using some other mechanism of creation, including evolution and billions of years. As Paul indicates in Romans 8, the corruption and groaning of the world came after the fall of man. That's why there's corruption and groaning and pain all throughout creation. If there was no fall of man and no death brought into the world on the basis of sin, then there is really no need for a Savior. So, again, one of the problems with some of these other theories in approaching the old earth is that we know that it was written in stone by the finger of God in Exodus 20:11. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Okay, well, we went through some of this before, the scientific foreknowledge in the Bible. There's just all these examples of things that came to be known that we didn't know before. I mean, there are amazing things like the water cycle, springs in the sea in Job 38, that's amazing, trenches in the sea, presence of mountains in the sea. That all of these in the scriptures that are, we haven't known until very recent times. But I think I'm going way past what I wanted to do here. Any discussion or questions? We have a minute or two here. I mean, I thought we were going to have more time. Sorry. Anybody have a solution? Well, that's a very good point, and that's one of the ones that Dr. Guthrie and I were just discussing. Is that I had one of the Jewish scholars that's from MIT, professor, a physicist. He has a very interesting, or I guess a lot of things he's produced, books he's written about this very idea, what you're talking about, of how time changes, obviously, by the speed you're involved with, and how that contraction of time and expansion of time occurs, and the perspective. And obviously, that early writing, those first 6 days, there was no human involved, and so it's really coming from the perspective of God. And so there's an amazing thing about that. I didn't know if you had a comment on that too. It's hard to comment briefly.